All right, welcome back from your breaks, everybody. Really excited here to have Thijs Feryn here from Varnish Software, the platinum sponsors of DrupalSouth, and he's going to talk to you all about Varnish for Drupal developers. We're aware this is a 40-minute session. We're going to make it a little bit squishy so we can get to the actual morning break in sort of a bit over half an hour's time. So if you've got questions and stuff, go and see him and the team on the booth afterwards. And they're more than happy to talk to you all day about Varnish, caching, VCL, and the works.
Exactly. Thank you, Toby. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here. I wasn't supposed to be here. There is another Drupal event going on in Switzerland. And I was supposed to speak there. And then my lovely colleague, Cynthia, who's just walked by, said, Thijs, we need you in Melbourne. So here we are. And what a city it is. Do you know it's my first time in Australia now? Never been to Australia. Never been to Melbourne. And yeah, this is fantastic, and Formula One's in town, and everything's happening. So let's get started. But there's no way to get started without having the connection. We had the previous presentation about making connections. I want to make a connection to you. And usually I would ask you to come down closer, but I was seated there, and I know if you sit on the first 3 rows, your neck is going to hurt a bit. So I do not hold it against you. What I would like to try is I do a lot of public speaking, and I use 3 distinct statements to get a feel of the audience. I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to present 3 distinct statements, and it's up to you whether to agree or not. So ladies and gentlemen, here at the ACMI in Melbourne, do we agree that slow websites suck? Great. That's good. If the answer would be no, I'd be in a lot of trouble. So here's number 2. Do we agree that web performance is an essential part of the user experience? Yeah, of course, because it's a competitive market. And it was all about humanizing a couple of minutes ago, so this is quite relevant. Like, if things aren't really tailored to your needs and you don't like the experience, you go elsewhere. And web performance is part of that. Here's number 3, in my opinion, slightly more controversial. I had yeses, I had nos, but the general consensus of what I'm about to show you is meh. Do we agree that a slow website is just as bad as a website that is down? Yes? Are there no's? Are there meh? Like, Well, yeah. Well, what happens if your website is slow or down, regardless of your opinion, is you lose money, you lose face, might lose a little bit of Google PageRank. So how do we tackle this? How do we approach this? What the problem is that a lot of people approach this from a very symptomatic point of view and say, oh, well, it's slow. It must be a capacity issue. And they start throwing servers at the problem. And don't get me wrong, when the house is on fire and you need to do firefighting, this could work. But in the long run, this is not sustainable because you're just throwing money at the problem rather than solving the root cause. And as the famous poet Notorious B.I.G. once said, mo money, mo servers, mo problems. So we already qualify that as not a sustainable solution in the long run. Now, I've done these presentations long enough time to know that I need to keep this slide up for a while until the people have taken the picture. But what I need to tell you is that throwing servers at the problem is not the solution. There are other ways. And another way could be identifying the slowest parts. And in Drupal, and in PHP, and in the larger cloud and orchestration ecosystems, there are a lot of measurement tools that can help you figure out what is going on. So do that. Identify the slowest parts and optimize accordingly. But be aware of the fact that after a while you'll hit the limits, the so-called point of diminishing returns, where the amount of money you invest in trying to make it faster doesn't yield you that same result in the long run. You cannot optimize your way out of a scalability problem. So what do you do then? Well, this is what my presentation will be about, is about caching. Caching, I love using the metaphor of the boxes, storing pre-computed results in boxes for later use. That's the topic. And that being said, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. Again, last month, I didn't even know I was coming here. My name is Thijs, and yes, I'm quite used to explaining that to everyone who doesn't speak Dutch. I'm a Dutch-speaking Belgium, which in the Drupal world is not a foreign country that much. I mean, the guy who invented it is Belgium. And I remember, I always throw in this little anecdote. I was working at a hosting company for 15 years, and in 2007, we were considering using Drupal for our corporate website. And what we did is we called Dries, and Dries came to our office and explained what Drupal was all about. That was 2007. That would not happen in the year 2025. Now, I hold the title of the technical evangelist at Varnish Software, which is quite a lot, I know, and the picture certainly doesn't help. But I do a lot of outreach, I do a lot of presentations. This is my 274th presentation, and I'm so proud and happy to be able to add Australia to that list, so thank you for having me. I also write books. This is my old book, Getting Started with Varnish Cache. Tremendous honor to doing it with O'Reilly. I have my little animal there. No, I couldn't pick the animal. However, based on my facial expression, you'll see I'm not really excited about that book. And you saw my colleague Cynthia walk over here with the new book. It's called, newer book, Varnish 6 by Example. I wrote this during the COVID pandemics. The pandemics were long, the lockdowns were long, and this is a 778 page. Thing is, this copy, I'll put it here, and I will walk off the stage, and I will not take that book. If you're interested in having the book, grab it, and you can come to our stand and have a chat with me. So Varnish Software, who's heard about us? I'd like to see some hands. You should have, because we're one of the sponsors, but maybe you know what we do. And if you don't, we're a company that builds software-defined web acceleration and content delivery solutions with a very strong emphasis on software-defined. We're just software. You can install it wherever you want, on your own servers with a hosting company, using packages. You can launch us in the cloud, using our official machine images in the marketplaces. We have official Docker images. You can orchestrate it using our Helm chart. So it's software. You have freedom of architecture and freedom of infrastructure. You just throw it wherever you want. And we do more than just accelerate websites and APIs. We accelerate all the things. So if it speaks HTTP, you can count on us to accelerate it. And we see and I didn't know this joining Varnish Software, but I've been there for 6 years now. I've seen it evolve into accelerating video streaming platforms, CI/CD pipelines, Docker image delivery, you name it. If it has HTTP, we'll make it faster. Now, of course, I do need to acknowledge that despite our efforts of building software-defined solutions, that we're also the company behind this very popular open source project. So who knows Varnish because of the open source project in here? Quite a number, quite a number. I have to acknowledge that. And I also acknowledge that this is a really integral part of Drupal as well. There are documentation pages about our technology, both open source and other. There is a link to that tutorial I wrote on Drupal.org, and that's a good resource to get started. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Varnish is assuming the role of a reverse caching proxy, meaning it sits right between Drupal and the user. And it does two things. On the one hand, it offloads a lot of pressure from Drupal. By sitting in front of Drupal, we can cache the responses and ensure that we don't always need to communicate with Drupal at large scale. So that's very much a quality of service thing, which is good. But the other benefit is by caching it inside that Varnish cache, and serving it to requesting users, we can do that delivery a lot faster. And that's a quality of experience thing. So that's the role we assume. And it's not that we reinvented the wheel or anything. We rely heavily on the built-in caching mechanism that HTTP already has. We do it, but Drupal does it as well. So these are two headers that Drupal emits. So if you have caching enabled in the performance setting in your Drupal configuration, and you set it to a day, that header will be emitted. Cache control, max age, 86,400, public. And we will understand that as a cache, and other systems will too, and will cache those pages accordingly. If the pages can't be cached, well then the one at the bottom will be emitted by Drupal and will respect that as well. It's just part of all the HTTP standards that we comply to, and we assume that some of our competitors or alternative products do so as well. And that's really easy if you have to cache static things like static HTML and imagery, CSS, JavaScript. Super easy. However, when state is involved, things get slightly more complicated. Here's a statement. Varnish doesn't cache when it sees a cookie out of the box. Who is here has seen modern-day websites that don't use cookies? Only one hand. Because modern-day websites do use cookies, either the cookies that Drupal offers or a whole range of marketing and tracking cookies that your marketing tools use. Also, Varnish doesn't cache when it sees an authorization header. And this is not a flaw or shortcoming. This is by design, because we know that the content that we're presenting, if it relies on a cookie or an authorization header, that it's highly personalized. It's for your eyes only. And if you would store it in the cache, really dangerous things could happen. You've heard the war stories of, well, I had it in the past where I stored something in the cache that was highly personalized and everyone could see it. So by design, we don't do it. However, that doesn't mean we can't use it in Drupal setups or in the real world. There is a built-in programming language involved called the VCL, which is short for Varnish Configuration Language. It's our own programming language. It's a domain-specific language that is used not to define all the behavior, because the behavior is already there. I told you about it. Hey, we don't cache when we see a cookie. But through that language, you can override that behavior. And that happens within a finite state machine. And this is the representation of that in a flowchart. I hope everyone can read a flowchart. So these are the different stages, every one of these blocks. And thanks to the VCL language, I'm not sure if you've seen VCL before, I'll show you in a minute, you can hook into each box that represents an execution flow and change it. And you can do that by setting behavior and can also influence the transitions. So let me take you to one of those flows. We start at the top left-hand corner. We start. We enter VCL receive, which is the part where HTTP requests come in. We inspect the request, perhaps do some modifications, and then check whether or not the request is deemed cacheable. If it is, we're going to create a lookup hash. We're going to transition into VCL hash. We're going to look up the item in the cache, and initially it will be a miss. So we'll follow the blue line, the blue arrow down to VCL miss, and that will trigger a fetch. Everything within that gray box is interaction with your backend. We can translate backend into Drupal in this context. So you do a fetch, a backend fetch, and when the response comes back, we can store it in the cache and deliver it to the user and end the transaction. But because there is a TTL that was defined, perhaps through a cache control header that you've seen earlier, the next time we do that, we go from VCL receive, we do a return hash, we end up in VCL hash, but it is a cache hit now, so we can follow the green arrow to VCL hit and deliver it immediately without the need to interact with Drupal again for the foreseeable time. And that's the execution flow, and that's how you can use VCL. Here's an extract, not the full one, that's Drupal specific to do things. What we do here is define a backend. In this case, Drupal lives at drupal.example.com, a hypothetical host name, on port 80. And inside VCL receive, we check whether things are cacheable. But also, and that's what's happening on this slide, we're trying to optimize and sanitize the input. Because from a security perspective, we were taught that we can't trust the user. Don't trust the client, don't do it. What we're doing here, especially that first if statement, if request URL matches a regular expression, where the end of the expression is a question mark, that is done to improve the hit rate. So imagine, and I think the comment in green already spoils it a bit, that your URL ends with a question mark. If you use a question mark, the implication is that you will define query string parameters. But if the parameters are not there and it's just a question mark, we would very much like to strip off that question mark. Reason being, although the output will be the same, the URL will be different from a string perspective, and the lookup hash will be different. So that will trigger a cache miss. So we need to clean things up as much as possible by trimming off trailing question marks, by removing port numbers from the host header, which is the second bit, by alphabetically sorting the query string parameters. Because if someone is clever and reorders the query string parameters, the output will be the same, but it will trigger a cache miss. So that's what happens. Other things that happen are really closely tied in to cacheability. If we see URLs that match this regular expression pattern, we know they can't be cached. So we influence this. We override the standard behavior, and we do return pass, which will, if we go back here, will follow the red arrow. And we'll bypass the cache, because we know this cannot end up in the cache ever. Same thing when cookies are there. Cookies are tricky. I've explained that. So what we're doing in this expression is doing a find and replace on the cookies. And we remove every single cookie except the ones in that pattern. So if we see a session cookie, which is Drupal's way of setting a cookie when you log in into the admin panel, we will bypass the cache. If we see a no cache cookie, we will bypass the cache. But we'll remove anything else, because all these other cookies are marketing cookies probably set by your Google Analytics or HubSpot or whatever you're using. And they're not used by Drupal. They're used by the JavaScript tools that are loaded. So it's important for your caching hit rate to trim them off. And yeah, I agree, this is really ugly to read, and it's regular expressions, and we all hate them. In more recent versions of Varnish, because this is, I didn't invent this, right? This has been a living thing in the Drupal community for ages. But if you're using a relatively recent version of Varnish, you can just use a cleaner interface. So if the cookie is set, if the request object that has the HTTP headers, and there is a cookie header, then parse the cookie header, remove all the cookies based on regular expression, and then you have the expression, write it back, And if in the end it's nothing more than a collection of white space characters, you can strip off the cookie and have cacheability. So that's how we deal with the cookies, and that's how we make it more cacheable. And it's part of a larger VCL template that you can easily find on the internet or on that tutorial. This is the one that is referenced on Drupal.org. So if you go to the Varnish docs page on Drupal.org, this is the one you'll find. Now, I'm not just here to promote this tutorial. I'm also here to invite you to contribute to this. Not in a way that you have to write things, but if you read it and you don't agree, or you find flaws in it, or you have ideas on making it better, do let me know. You can find me online later. I will definitely respond to those messages, because I want this to be an excellent resource for the community. So if you see it and it doesn't add up, let me know. So let's do some practical things. We're 15 minutes in already, so let's get a little bit practical. Because it's not only about teaching you how Varnish works, it's also about showing you how you can connect it to Drupal, which is equally important for your success rate. So when you go into your Drupal, I talked about performance and about setting the TTL. You can easily do that. You can set it to a day by default. And I would try to set it as high as possible for the sake of your hit rate. And then when you set it, Drupal will start emitting this header. This is the standard. This is how it happens. If you don't, you'll get no cache headers. But cache purging is also important. And I'd like to use sort of the comparison and the anecdote of media companies. A lot of media companies, I guess, use Drupal. Let's say you're an online newspaper and you publish your content, it's nicely cached, quality of experience and quality of service are excellent. However, there's a breaking news item. And in your Drupal, you publish the article, you press save, and no one sees it. Breaking news is not breaking because it's stored in the cache. So a lot of people think, oh, then we need to reduce the TTLs of the cache. But you can never know when that update takes place. So my advice is use a really big TTL, have it in the cache for as long as you can, and use cache purging methodologies that Drupal supports to remove objects from the cache explicitly when the changes occur. So you can do a composer require on Drupal and then load purge purger HTTP, which is a generalistic non-Varnish specific module that works with different kinds of CDNs caches. It's pretty nice. So you install it, and you leverage tags in Drupal. I remember the olden days in Drupal where there were no tags, and anyone who tried to do cache invalidation would try to figure out what affected URLs were for a content block that changed. It's not like I remember the old days in WordPress where you only had a page, a blog post, a category, a tag, a feed. Drupal had complicated and complex content types for ages. So a little block could end up on 100 different pages. And if you change the value of the content of that content block, good luck trying to figure out what URLs were affected, right? So what the Drupal community did that I commend them for is use tags like the one you're seeing here to categorize content, to segment pages, but also to identify pages. So this is a response header that will be returned by Drupal if you enable that module. And it contains a bunch of tags that are not always relevant, but I highlighted the one to identify this object, which is node 1. And then in the configuration of that, because then in the performance section, you'll have a purge UI where you can configure purgers. And I am configuring a purger, and I'm leveraging the purge cache tags header. And there is this thing called invalidation expression, which if you would press the tokens tab, you'll see the value, you can copy and paste it in. And that will be replaced on the fly with the actual tags or URLs that Drupal is intending to invalidate. And the way then it works, so what you need to know is that it will communicate with Varnish, send a ban request, and I'll show you what that looks like later on, and we'll pick it up and remove the relevant objects from the cache based on the tags. And you can do that by saving the page. So if you enable the late runtime processor, as soon as you change a page, it will automatically send those requests to Varnish. But you can do it in a different way as well. Using the drush command, you can explicitly invalidate a tag, empty the entire cache, remove explicit URLs or paths. Or if you don't enable the late runtime processor and you want to handle or you want to queue invalidations and execute them at later stages, you can either call drush pq work to process the queue or to do it via drush cron. But, and here's where I need to shift it a bit, there are some limitations to it. And these are limitations not necessarily in Drupal. I see that there's limitations in Varnish as well. And this allows me or requires me to give a little bit of context and explanation on the disparity or the differences between what the open source project does and what we do. Although we are the company behind the open source project, we do not have complete control over the open source project, which is a good thing. No corporate entity should control a project like that in its entirety. There is a project lead who decides on things, and we, as an entity, as a commercial entity, sometimes see certain limitations that we try to tackle ourselves. Common obstacles are that there's, at this point, no native TLS implementation in Varnish Cache. And it might change, but for the foreseeable future, the open source project will help you terminate TLS, but it doesn't have TLS natively. Backends are processed statically, so that means if the DNS resolution changes while your Varnish is running, Varnish won't see it. Cache invalidation is a bit tricky, and I'll show you how Drupal approaches it. It's not the best solution, but it works in a way, and there's also no soft purging, which I'll also show you how to tackle. Managing storage and memory is not easy, and understanding VCL isn't always great. So what we did is we came up with a solution to tackle this in a commercial offering. Now, I'm not a salesperson. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just going to show you some technology. But what I do want to mention is, and if you were here for the keynote, you saw my little opening video. We identified a subset of features in our enterprise offering that we believe will be valuable to you. My goal is not to sell you anything, especially not the enterprise offering, because I acknowledge that not everyone in this room or the organization we represent is actually an enterprise. So we handpicked a couple of features, thrown them into an exclusive offer, and allowed us by doing so to reduce the price by 90% and even offering a 6-month free trial for those of you who want to trial those features. So if you have certain challenges by using Varnish at a certain scale, try it out. It's pretty much no strings attached. So speaking of native TLS, what we wanted to do is tackle that and offer native TLS end-to-end, meaning clients to Varnish and Varnish to Drupal. So what you can do now is add an extra listening port, which if you use Varnish, you'll do nonetheless for terminated TLS. But it's the keyword HTTPS that makes all the difference. By adding that keyword, we all of a sudden know that you're trying to use TLS. And using Varnish ADM, which is a command you use to manage aspects of Varnish, you can do TLS cert load to load the certificate. And then how you would do that practically is you would have a file with a certain amount of commands in it. Maybe that file is called CLI.cfg. You close the socket, you start the running process, you load your certificate, you commit the certificate, and you open up the socket again. And that file will be tied into the runtime process via the -i uppercase parameter, which ensures that every time Varnish starts, it will load those certificates. And be aware that if your certificates expire or you need to do changes, you can dynamically reload certificates without the need to restart the cache, which means the cache won't get emptied. And I promised you end-to-end TLS. We also added some syntax to the backend definition. This is a Drupal-specific one, where you just set SSL to 1. You have additional parameters there. You set your port to 443. And all of a sudden, you have end-to-end TLS. That's one of those things. The second thing I want to show you is what we call the memory governor. It's a feature so specific, and I like the name so much I created this in Photoshop. And it really, the name and the image really covers the subject. What we do is we govern the memory, or we manage the memory. And it's based on a common misconception that I'll explain in a second. So the memory governor is a specific storage engine that limits the size, the memory size of the entire Varnish process, rather than just the cache. And here's the misconception. This is how you'll do it regularly. You use the memory allocator storage engine to store objects in the cache in memory, and you may allocate 8 gigabytes, thinking that, oh, this is just 8 gigabytes that Varnish will use. Well, it will use it only for the storage, but there are runtime requirements as well. And those who have used Varnish at a significant scale will see that if you have a large amount of objects, the accounting for the objects will also consume memory, and the threads required to handle all those incoming requests, depending on the complexity of your VCL, will also consume memory. So by switching that up from malloc to MSE, which is in our offering, all of a sudden you have dynamic memory management. So if you have a low traffic website, maybe you can use 89 gigabytes for cache storage. And then maybe 500 megabytes for object accounting, depending on the size of your cache. Maybe 500 megabytes for request handling if you have a decent amount of threads. And a little bit of headroom so we're comfortable. As soon as we notice that you have a sudden spike of traffic, we will resize the cache to give more memory to the runtime requirements. And because the cache is not a source of truth, it's not a database, it's okay to reduce it temporarily. There'll be some cache misses, but that can be picked up. Because the alternative in open source is that you go out of memory. And as the company behind it also offering support, we've seen that quite a number of times. And the way you configure is by simply adding -s MSE, and the factory setting is to allocate 80% of the server's memory. But you can change that on the fly with the memory target runtime parameter and set it to another percentage or an absolute value. All right, I have a good 5 minutes left, so we're a good 25 minutes into this session. And as a sponsor, we were promised a 40-minute slot. And I could fill that up if you're interested, but I'm conscious of breaks and all. So let's try to do this in 30, max 35 minutes, so I can give you back that time. But I do want to emphasize this. This is a big one. I do want to spend enough time on tag-based invalidation and give you that notion of what soft purging is. So remember these tags? I showed them to you earlier. Drupal sets them, especially in that module. They get captured as a response header, and we'll store them in the cache. Now, the current implementation, and here's some specific VCL on cache invalidation, here's how that works. So the invalidation module, the purge module, will send a ban request. What is a ban request? It's a request using the ban request method, which is a non-official request method that, along with purge, is used a lot by caches. It's very direct in its approach. It says, I want to ban content from the cache. And we add a safeguard using an ACL, an access control list, to ensure that not everyone can ban. Because if I would know that your website has a ban interface, and I'm trying to be naughty, I'll just send purge and ban requests to your website, and eventually it will go down. So we need to protect people with an access control list that can contain host names, IP addresses, and subnets of those who are allowed to do it. And typically, you would put your Drupal servers or the IPs or subnets of them in there. Once we've established that, we will look for the purge cache tags header, which if you paid attention, you saw the interface, and you saw that I defined a purge cache tags header with an invalidation expression. That's where that comes in. So as soon as we see it, we will try to match all the objects with the tags, with the ones that are stored. It will issue a ban. And we'll store that in the cache. And this is what that would look like, hypothetically. So let's say you store something in the cache with node 1. As soon as you change something in Varnish, in my case, 3 distinct ban requests were sent by Drupal to Varnish, saying remove node 1, remove node list, and remove node list page. And those end up on the so-called ban list. So if you do Varnish ADM ban list, you'll see them being put there. The downside of this is that every ban expression needs to be evaluated against every object in the cache. So if you have 1 million objects in the cache and 100 bans, you'll have 100 million expressions that need to be evaluated. And that could become tedious from a CPU perspective. So the way we do it in the offer that we have for you is leverage our Y-key module, which is a pure tag-based cache invalidation module, allowing us to inspect that header, use a separator, and allowing you to specify multiple tags at once. And if you check the logs, you see that we index them. This is a first-class citizen in the offering. And also, we can add specific keys like the everything key that we attach to every object. So if we want to remove everything from the cache, we just match that tag and other things we can do. So this gives you the opportunity to define, instead of a regular HTTP purger, a bundled purger. And instead of using a regular expression, you can use a comma-separated expression, and Drupal will handle that for you. Meaning that we can now leverage this module in the specific VCL, and the output, and this is the output, you do a ban request. These are logs from our system. We see that we're trying to invalidate node list page, and node 1. We match the access control list. This subnet is my Docker setups subnet. So we're good. We've matched that. And then we invalidate all these keys separately and come to the conclusion that one object was affected, namely node 1. And because, and here's the kicker, here's the important bit, because this third argument was set to true, we're doing this with soft purging. And the reason that in other communities, like I consider myself a PHP community member, and I go to Magento events and Shopware events and Drupal events and WordPress events. And especially in these e-commerce communities, I think it applies to Drupal as well, soft purging is important. Because hard purging means as soon as you match the objects, you remove them from the cache immediately, meaning you are exposed. So if the next visitor comes in, or a lot of visitors come in for the affected pages, they will have to wait until Drupal responds, which is a problem sometimes. So by enabling soft purging rather than removing the object from the cache, we tag it as expired. So instead, we just say TTL0 object expired, and we serve, or we keep serving the old content to the user from a quality of experience perspective, while we do an asynchronous revalidation, and there's eventual consistency. And that takes away a lot of pressure. And that's all based on this calculation. The total object lifetime in the cache is the sum of the TTL, which is 86,400 in my example, grace, which is tolerated staleness. So if your TTL hits 0, but there's grace left, and by default there is some, we will keep serving old stuff while asynchronously revalidating. And keep, but that's irrelevant, is also part of it to keep the objects around. So what soft purging does is rather than removing the object from the cache, it sets that TTL to 0. And you're still good. And how do you set grace? Well, in the templates, we set it to a pretty high value. You could set it to 3 days if you want to. So 3 days past the expiration, we'll still be able to serve it. So here's a little bit of an example. We receive a request for the /test page. It has been invalidated. We look it up in the cache, and it's a cache hit. Great. But you can see that the TTL is minus 4.7 seconds, meaning we did a soft purge 4.7 seconds ago. But since there is 259,200 seconds, which is the equivalent of 3 days of grace left, it's a cache hit. We deliver it, but we hold true to our promise, and we do a background fetch to update the content. And that takes away a lot of pressure. And the last feature I want to talk about before I send you to your break, let's look at the time. We're 29 minutes and 55 seconds into this, is dynamic backends. So by default, DNS resolution in Varnish happens at compile time. So when the VCL file gets compiled, this Drupal.example.com hostname will be parsed, will be resolved, and the IP address will be used. Any changes to that DrupalExample.com will not be spotted by Varnish. So if something changes in an orchestrated, automated, scale-out, scale-in environment, Varnish won't be able to spot it unless you restart Varnish or reload the VCL. Also, the hostname can only return a single IP address, so no load balancing capabilities. So we felt the need to change that, and we've implemented or offered 2 modules, Active DNS and UDO. UDO is short for Unified Director Object. So we allow you to configure DNS resolution of host names. In this case, Drupal.example.com over port 443, we enforce or we force the TTL. So normally, DNS has TTLs as well. You can abide them. We force them to every 5 seconds. And the IPs that come out of it will parse into the template and the health check. And it supports regular A records, quad A records, and even SRV records, allowing you to actually get multiple results from a single host name, and then use a distribution algorithm to load balance if you have multiple Drupal sitting behind there. Using hash, fallback, random, you choose it. And this all happens dynamically, so every time you have a miss or a cache bypass, and you need to talk to Drupal, we will do Drupal.backend, we will subscribe to changes at the DNS level, and we'll do dynamic backends. And if you do a dig on your Linux or Mac system or whatever, for example, Drupal.example.com, and the hypothetical host names or IP addresses 1234 and 1235 come out, we will loop over it and do DNS-based load balancing. But we can elevate that to DNS-based service discovery, because it serves or it supports SRV records as well. And that's more of the notation you'll see in SRV services. Maybe it's a service called Drupal, a TCP service living on example.com. All of a sudden, you get all the output with the port number, so you're no longer married to your port number within the VCL. You can orchestrate that in DNS, and you can have weights and priorities, and all of a sudden, we will respect those. So we'll say, oh, this one has a higher priority, let's use it first, or let's give more weight to that host name, and you can really influence the entire load balancing, decision-making, and backend dynamics solely using one DNS record. And in Kubernetes, that works as well. So if you're using Drupal in Kubernetes, your services have a fixed name. So let's say you use the default namespace, and your service is called Drupal. You can use Drupal.default.svc.cluster.local. And whatever pods it's associated with will get those IP addresses and send the traffic to those Drupals. And you can even use the SRV record, which is always there, using a named port, _HTTPS, ._TCP, .Drupal default svc cluster.local. And we don't have to think about anything else. And all of this, what I've showed you so far, we optimize the VCL file that contains these features, and you can get it from us. I'm happy to deliver it to you. And it's all part of this special offer that we have that you can try out, no strings attached, for 6 months for free. And if you are really interested, I told you, we try to keep this very approachable for small and medium-sized companies. And the discount we give to give this to you with these select feature set is up to 90%. That's the story I have. And if you want free swag, you want to have a chat about Varnish, either open source or the offer, come visit our stand. How am I doing on time? 33 minutes, 35? That's better than 45 or 40 that I was promised. That being said, thanks again for having me, DrupalSouth audience. I wasn't expecting to be in Australia. I was expecting to be in Switzerland. But I'm so happy to be here. The weather's been fantastic. You had a bank holiday on Monday. I walked through Melbourne. Really enjoy it. Saw the Moomba Festival. I'm going to the Formula 1 on Friday. And I hope that I can get a lot more satisfaction by just chatting with you and enjoying this event. Toby, thanks for hosting me. And I will see you all later.